So welcome after the tea. It does take a while for people to settle in. Thank you for settling in. So thank you everyone for settling in. Thank you everyone for settling in, and I hope you enjoyed your tea and you had lovely fruit. And thank you to the University of Cork to provide us so well and to spoil us. Thank you. So it's my great pleasure to speak on the next topic on the SDGs and the Student Affairs and Services, and I speak with my great and very dear colleagues Lisa Bardil, Moscow-Tola and Brett Perosi as they're posing for the photograph, and Terry Lusha, who is sitting online in Cape Town, I think, at the moment. And I hope you can see us or hear us. So greeting from the four of us here to you here. So we'll present a study we did, and a lot of you were part of that study and participated in the study and responded to the questions, and we're very grateful for that. So we split it up slightly. I'll be talking 2 or 3 slides on the context of student affairs and services and the SDGs, and then we have, I think it's Brett, yes, on our findings, and then Lisa will speak about what that means for the practices, and then we go into the groups. So just in terms of the context of the SDGs, I need to say quite little because a lot has been said earlier this morning and you're all very familiar with them. But a few things I do want to highlight for our own reference again to keep it in the forefront of our minds. SDGs offer an ambitious global social justice framework. It is really a hugely impressive document to think that the entire world, I think there's two countries or 3 that haven't signed for other reasons, have committed themselves to these goals for better or for worse. Some of them are not doing so well. Some of them don't record and report on their advances as well as they should. Some are lagging behind for all kinds of other reasons, historical reasons, political reasons. But nonetheless, it's an ambitious framework, and we all have committed to this, and that's very important. The second part is that it's a deeply relational, contextual, and complex framework, and that means that's really one of the first global frameworks that puts us in deep relationship with one another. COVID has driven that home so well for everyone, but the SDGs say it very clearly. What happens in South America is very relevant to what happens in Russia. What happens in the Ukraine is very relevant on the other side of the world. We are in a relational space with one another. It is contextual. None of us are alone. We live and work and study in contexts. And it is complex. It's not just complicated, but complex, meaning whatever happens in one place impacts in not literal, linear, but in complex ways on other spaces. The knowledge and knower is no longer absolute. So knowledge isn't absolute. It's contextualized. It has meaning in context. Very important. The SDGs speak to personal and political agency. We're called upon to be activists, to be called upon to be agents of social justice in the spaces we're in. We no longer just help students cope and develop them, but we develop them for an outcome, for a better world, and everybody is an agent of that. Ideas that higher education are a meritocracy, that it's based on merit, are deeply challenged. We know people with privilege are advantaged, people with particular skin, particular gender, particular positions in families and regional spaces are born into privilege and have a much easier task than others. And the SDGs remind us deeply of that. Notions that success is built on inherent attributes or neutral skills are challenged. No longer are we just, oh, you know, that's a very bright student and she or he made it. It's about recognizing that certain spaces advantage certain people in unfair or in ways that we need to recognize, and we need to write that. We need to make sure that all spaces have these kinds of advantages, and we need to recognize it. So the SDGs is inclusive of people. It was driven, very grassroots document, very grassroots driven. It's inclusive of people and all spheres of life. It recognizes that student success comes from having electricity, from having food, from having parents that are safe, from having siblings that are safe, from not being married off into all kinds of situations, so student success is not just about individual commitment from a student, but it has to do with context. And it's for us to recognize it and write that context. Briefly, in terms of the literature for our research, we did a lot of literature review, and just to highlight a few things that stood out for us. The SDGs position higher education as a public good. And it's a wonderful, earlier on reference was made that some countries or some institutions are about individual advancement or about perhaps corporate interests, but it's a public good and we need to recognize it and we want to advance that. Learners must acquire Sdg knowledge. So they must be familiar with the idea of the SDGs and the relational framework of social justice, and they must have the skills to impact society. So they need to recognize injustices in system, when it's in the system or in structures, and they need to be able to act on these in sustainable, acceptable ways. So higher education is an essential element to achieving the 2030 agenda, which of course comes out of the SDGs. And here it is about research, teaching, student affairs is in there, and community engagement. And we know that there are agents of making Agenda 2030 happen. We impact on individual student development, on staff development, but also on structures, on systems, on processes, and our impact is on students as agents of change. Student affairs practitioners support some SDGs more than others, and we'll hear about that in a minute. And we found that student affairs and services are very compatible. So it's a very easy framework for us to assume. So now let me go on to the methodology of how we did this research. I'm going to speed through this one. This is really just for due diligence. It's questionnaires. We did a questionnaire, 25 questions and so forth. Our data collection was done by Qualtrics. We got institutional research approval from the American University of Georgia, thanks to Lisa. Our analysis, we got 360 replies, 318 were valid and usable. We used SPSS. And of course, limitations are always about self-report. There are always inherent limitations. Our snowball sampling means we reach some people more than others. That's part of the methodology. Just briefly in terms of participants, I think that's still my slide. You would recognize this 60% are in this age group, 35 to 54, slightly more female than male, 53 countries, which means that we can't generalize, or it's not useful to extract the data on one country. We're looking at regions, of course. And I'm going to skip over the results and hand over to Brett.
So we are going to move quickly, but I feel the need to mention that you know, we're a relational kind of a group, as Birgit set up with the SDGs. This is kind of a special experience for us because we meet almost every other week for an hour in 4 different time zones, and the 3 of us have never presented together, and it's actually the first time I've heard Birgit express some of those comments. You see them in writing because we do a bunch of writing together, and you don't always know exactly who wrote them. Now I know. Very, very eloquent. Yeah, I have kind of what I think is the easy part here because I'm talking about the results and what happened here with this study. And I'll go relatively quickly. We have some graphs to visually demonstrate the findings. So you can see here, I think you've been looking at this for just a little bit. I don't know if that's surprising to anyone, looking at almost 20% of the sample who basically had no familiarity, but yet a solid 80% that did. Here's our first graph, with the question being, to what extent does your higher education or organization support the SDGs? Because as you know, globally, not all student affairs and services practitioners or professionals are working for colleges and universities necessarily. A couple of things I think to point out here. The sample from Oceana was really quite small, but yet you can see the large percentage of those who answered that it's a high priority for the organization. This is a great visual representation. You can kind of use your eye to just take a quick look at this. I think Asia is important here too, at almost double in some cases, specifying an essential area, SDGs being supported by their institutions. And then North America, I think, is an anomaly on every slide. You might want to take a quick look as we go through these quickly to North America as well. So here, to what extent are student affairs and services professionals knowledgeable about the SDGs? So this isn't just to what extent are you personally knowledgeable, but what extent do you believe the student affairs folks that you work with are? And again, here you think, I think Africa and Asia is really interesting here, where you have very knowledgeable and quite a bit on the left-hand side of the screen. And again, you look over at the right-hand side, North America, bit of an anomaly, and Oceania is really interesting to me given the prior slide. Again, the N was really small, but then you're looking at such a huge percentage of somewhat on this slide. I don't know if I have the prowess to, let's see, I can. So just take a look here. You have Oceania, high priority, 67%. Go to the next slide, and you have the answers primarily being somewhat kind of curious, I think, there. Are you using the SDGs to inform your work directly or indirectly with students? This doesn't take much explanation because there's only 3 responses to this, yes, somewhat, and no. And you can kind of use your intuitive nature to see what we found here. Again, Africa and Asia, we might want to point out. And Europe, I think, is really quite interesting in this slide as well, with almost 40% saying no. So this is, I believe, really important because we've had speakers mention that we have infused the SDGs throughout the global summits over time. And these 5 are not always the same 5 that come up. For example, in Chile, we were very intentional about what are the top 5. It was almost a voting kind of a concept that we used to arrive at the top 5 through that process. Well, through this research, quality education, the clear winner, which certainly makes sense. Good health and well-being also makes sense. Gender equality, reduced inequalities, 2 items on inequality. We know through some research, actually Lisa primarily and Denny Roberts, we know that there's a social justice underpinning to what we do globally in student affairs and services, and we're seeing it here. I was slightly surprised to see partnerships be one of the top 5. With so many opportunities and options there, choosing 17 as partnerships, I thought really says a lot. I believe we're to practices now.
By quickly because you guys are going to get in groups. So I do want to mention that we're doing this real quickly, but we do hope we'll be publishing some of this. So down the road, we'll share that through the IASIS social media or platforms, something like that. But anyway, this is important going into the next steps because this came out of Toronto. I don't know if you guys, how many were in the Toronto virtual? At the end of it, right, one of the things that people said is we wanted to know what others are doing. There were 140 there, but we wanted to know what was happening in student affairs and services. There's a gap in the literature specifically on student affairs and services and how they're using the SDGs. So we wanted to try to fill some of that gap to get started. So just to understand the practices and what we learned from those that were participated in the study is that we kind of can cluster them around 3 things. And I think that Professor Michael Murphy today and also Professor O'Halloran yesterday kind of talked about some of these, but the individual impact that the SDGs can have on students and this idea of them, of us in student affairs and services, looking at how do we educate students and develop students to understand how they can make a strong and be attitudinal change makers, you know, I don't know if that's the right word I'm trying to say, but that they can go out there and make an impact, like the sustainable impact that, because there are social justice lens, like what Professor Murphy said today, student leaders are really in touch with more of this information than we are. And we need to be engaged as passionately and help them understand how they can make a difference in the world and understand the SDGs and the global aspects of the SDGs as they move forward and graduate, and cultivating those and help cultivate those graduate attributes. And again, you'll see some of these too on what we learned on how institutions were using them through strategies, processes, structures that I could share with you. So some of the things we learned that we saw that mainly how our student affairs service practitioners globally were using the SDGs was through community engagement programs. There was one that told us about how they early on find out what the students are passionate about, and then they engage them with the community. They find those areas, what they're interested career-wise, and find those areas to engage them outside of the university to get them mindful, and then use the SDGs as part of the lens. Also, leadership development. Some of this was one type of programming. It might be one program on leadership that we do at a conference on campus, but it could also be other things that are happening externally, like partnerships with other ministries, or other ways that there might be something happening in the community around SDGs, and partnering with those groups as well. It was a guiding philosophy. I think we mentioned this, but one of the things we found is that Birgit said so eloquently, is that people really understood that this framework could fit for what they do. It was very important to them, like words like direction, shaping vision, fighting for resources, and for students. And so you see this, it was a guiding philosophy about how to do this and how important it was. We think about food insecurity and that SDG and so forth. So these are some of the things we saw as guiding philosophy. And then partnerships with government, like I said, and non-government institutions. But partnerships internally at the university came out too, and that's a really important piece. We don't always reach out to our academic communities sometimes and see what they're doing. We know it's happening a lot at universities, in the SDGs with research. Talk with the research office, see what faculty are doing, see what's happening in the curriculum, and how that can be partnered and how we can work with them. Specific examples, again, this is very interesting. You'll see in a moment, but there was a lot on, we would think, on the SDG around climate action, composting. So these were some things that were happening a lot. Gender studies, about gender equality. Curriculum, including that at extracurriculum. When I'm saying curriculum, I'm also talking about the extracurriculum that we plan and the teaching and learning that we do as student affairs professionals and how we do it. And so these were some of the things that were built into that as well. The other thing is, programs like reduction of energy consumption. The SDGs were built into some strategic objectives. We heard that some in student affairs, their strategic plan had the SDGs in there. So we learned that as well. Conferences, we learned that there were some offices that were just geared towards sustainability, and that student affairs was partnering with those offices as well. Courses on SDGs, I can go on some of these as well here. The interesting thing here is that we kind of themed in our analysis, and when we looked at practices and asked our professional, how are you actually practicing the SDGs with your students? You'll notice here a lot is under the environmental and sustainability, and then research and curriculum. Here's the thing that I think is important for us to think about, and I think it was Professor O'Halloran that said, and I agree, and we talked about this last year, we need to think about the SDGs, the other SDGs, and how they feed into the climate as well. Just the food insecurity, how that feeds into the climate, land, water usage, all that feeds into it. And this was interesting, but this gives you an idea of where the lens were and what was happening on campuses. And I think this is kind of interesting, but you see some of these things. You see a lower piece about the financial piece, even though I know student affairs practitioners, and I know that they're interested in making sure there's access and student success. And we know even with COVID, some of our research globally, that they were there, the ones making sure there were grants and meeting the needs of the students. Even though that came down here a little bit lower, I think it is part of what we do. It just might not be labeled under the lens of an SDG. So as we move forward, I wanted to just say, as we move forward, we want to hear from you. One of the things we want to do is understand what you guys think that we could, how could our work of the SDGs inform what we do? And I think Birgit said this as well. We need to do this together. We need to partner with the academic community. We need to be aware of the SDGs. We need to have more conversation about what they are, because I will tell you, even though I think Professor Murphy talked about students that, you know, in high school or in secondary school that are learning about the climate, they're also learning about the SDGs. So they're going to come to our campus and they're going to be wondering, why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we looking at things? There were some examples too where they were structuring student organizations using the SDGs. There was one university too that their whole academic catalog was categorized by the SDGs, which I thought was interesting. So when student picked classes, they were categorized. So I think some of the lenses, some of the things we could do. So today what we're going to do, Kat Calleran over here is on our committee, and she helped create our little curriculum we're going to do together in our small groups. So we're going to move into small groups, and we're going to talk about a little bit more about how we can see these SDGs informing our work. We said it was a framework we believed in, 92% said it, but how are we implementing that? Let's talk more about what are those practices we could do. And in the end, our outcome is that we will be able to create a document that shares what we can all do and how we can influence and meet the Agenda 2030 that we have to make the world a better planet, and use our students as part of that. So that's our goal in the groups. I think I went through pretty fast. I haven't heard a gong yet.